The baobab tree stood like an ancient witness against the amber sky, its massive trunk scarred by centuries of harmattan winds and the whispered prayers of countless generations. Beneath its sprawling canopy, Aminata Sankara pressed her grandmother's cowrie shell necklace against her chest, feeling the weight of ancestors' dreams and the burden of promises yet to be fulfilled. Barkada safe, she whispered to the wind, the house a greeting carrying across the red earth of Ouagadougou as if summoning the spirits of Thomas Sankara himself, the revolutionary president whose name she bore, whose blood ran through her veins like liquid fire. The letter in her weathered leather satchel crackled as she adjusted it, the presidential seal of Burkina Faso catching the last rays of sunset. 3 weeks she had waited for this summons, 3 weeks since her exposé on the French uranium mines had shaken the corridors of power from Paris to Bamako. Now President Traoré wanted to see her, wanted to hear the truth she had unearthed from the mouths of dying miners and the tears of widowed mothers. But which truth? The question echoed in the cavity of her chest like a drum's hollow beat. The morning air tasted of dust and possibility as Aminata made her way through the bustling streets of Sector 15, where the corrugated iron roofs gleamed like scales of some sleeping dragon. Children's laughter punctuated the symphony of morning prayers from the mosque, while vendors hawking their wares in a mixture of Moor, French, and the lingua franca of survival that transcended all borders. "Sister Aminata," called Fatou the groundnut seller, her voice cutting through the market's cacophony. "You fly to meet the big man today, eh?" Aminata paused at the woman's stall, inhaling the earthy aroma of fresh peanuts roasting over charcoal. "How do you know these things, Mama Fatou?" The older woman's eyes crinkled with knowing mischief, her fingers never pausing as she stirred the nuts. "The wind carries many stories, Ngoni. Some say you carry fire in your pen, fire that burns the white man's lies. Others say..." She lowered her voice, glancing around with the practiced caution of one who had survived too many coups and counter-coups. "Others say fire can burn the one who holds it too long." Aminata's hand instinctively moved to her satchel, where her notebook lay filled with testimonies that could topple governments or build new ones. The uranium mines of Arlit, the secret deals with French mining companies, the cancer rates in the villages downriver, all of it documented with the precision of a surgeon and the passion of a poet. "And what do you say, Mama Fatou?" The woman lifted a handful of nuts to her nose, breathing in their essence before letting them cascade back into the pan. "I say the ancestors speak through those who are brave enough to listen. But sometimes, child, the ancestors' voices get lost in the noise of our own ambitions." The presidential palace loomed against the azure sky like a monument to contradictions. Traditional Burkinabe architecture married to French colonial grandeur, red brick and white pillars standing in awkward harmony. As Aminata's taxi wound through the security checkpoints, she caught glimpses of gardeners tending to imported roses while indigenous baobab seedlings struggled in the manicured shadows. "First time meeting the president?" asked the driver, his eyes finding hers in the rearview mirror. "Aye," she replied in Moor, then caught herself slipping into her mother tongue. In French, she added, "I've covered his speeches but never spoken with him directly." The driver's hands tightened on the wheel. "My brother worked in the mines," he said quietly, "before the sickness took him. You wrote about men like him, didn't you?" Aminata's throat constricted. "What was his name?" "Burima. Burima Ouedraogo. He used to say the rocks down there glowed like captured moonlight, but that the moonlight was poisoned." The driver's voice carried the weight of unshed tears. "He died believing his sacrifice would feed his children. Instead, it fed French shareholders." They rode in silence after that, the taxi's engine humming a lament that seemed to rise from the very earth beneath them. President Traoré received her in his private study, a room that struck Aminata as carefully curated to project both power and authenticity. Kent cloth draped one wall while French leather-bound volumes lined another. A bronze sculpture of Thomas Sankara stood on his desk beside a photograph of the current president shaking hands with Emmanuel Macron. "Mademoiselle Sankara," he said, rising from behind his mahogany desk with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to being watched. "Your reputation precedes you like the drums before a festival." He was smaller than she had expected, his presence more subtle than the commanding figure he cut at public rallies. But his eyes, dark as cola nuts and twice as bitter, held the intensity of a man carrying the weight of 8 million souls. "Bon arrivé, Mr. President," she replied, accepting his offered hand. His grip was firm, calloused, the hands of someone who had known real work before politics claimed him. "Please sit." He gestured to a chair upholstered in traditional Bogolan mudcloth. "Would you prefer to speak in French or more?" The question caught her off guard. In official settings, French was expected, almost demanded. More would honor me, but I suspect our conversation will require precision. Ah. His smile was cryptic. You assume precision belongs only to the colonizer's tongue? Perhaps this is our first lesson today. Perhaps this is our first lesson today. He settled back into his chair, steepling his fingers as his gaze swept over her like a farmer assessing his fields before harvest. Your articles have caused quite a stir, my dear. The French ambassador has called me 3 times this week. The mining companies are threatening to pull their investments. My economic advisors speak of you as if you were a plague of locusts. Aminata felt her spine straighten, the familiar fire kindling in her chest. Truth often inconveniences those who profit from lies, Mr. President. Truth. He tasted the word like bitter cola. Tell me, Mademoiselle Sankara, what do you believe truth looks like for a nation caught between its past and its future, between the demands of its people and the realities of global politics? She opened her satchel, withdrawing the notebook that had become her constant companion. Truth looks like Mariam Zongo, who holds her dead husband's photograph while she coughs blood into a basin. Truth looks like children playing in radioactive dust because their parents don't know the French words for danger or contamination. Truth looks like... Stop. His hand rose, palm outward. The gesture was gentle but final. I don't need you to recite your articles to me. I've read them. Every word. Every testimony. Every damning statistic. He stood and walked to the window, his silhouette framed against the Ouagadougou skyline where minarets and cell towers competed for space in the heavens. What I need to know is this. Do you understand the difference between truth and justice? The question hung in the air like incense smoke, heavy with implications Aminata couldn't quite grasp. She watched as the president's reflection wavered in the window glass, distorted by the afternoon heat rising from the courtyard below. I'm not sure I follow, Mr. President. He turned back to her, his expression unreadable. 20 years ago, when I was studying law in Paris, I lived in a tiny apartment in Belleville. My neighbor was an old Algerian man named Hassan who had fought in their independence war. One evening, over shared tea, he told me something I've never forgotten. The president moved to a small cabinet, withdrawing 2 glasses and an ornate teapot that gleamed with silver inlay. As he prepared the tea with practiced movements, he continued. Hassan said that during the war, his unit once captured a French colonel who had been torturing prisoners. They had evidence, witnesses, everything needed to execute him for war crimes. But Hassan's commander ordered the colonel's release. He poured the tea, the aromatic steam rising between them. Hassan was furious. He demanded to know why they would let such a monster go free. Aminata accepted the tea, noting how the president's hands remained steady despite the weight of his story. What did his commander say? He said that killing the colonel would be the truth, justice for the crimes committed. But releasing him would serve a greater truth, showing the world that Algerians could be more merciful than their oppressors, that independence meant rising above the cycle of vengeance. The tea was sweet with honey and sharp with mint, flavors that seemed to dance with the complexity of the tale. Aminata set down her glass carefully. And do you agree with Hassan's commander? That, the president said, settling back into his chair, is precisely what I'm trying to determine. The room fell silent except for the distant call to prayer from the Grand Mosque, its melodic Arabic flowing over the city like a river of faith. Aminata felt the weight of generations pressing down upon her shoulders. Her grandmother who had sewn French uniforms for colonial administrators while singing more resistance songs under her breath, her father who had taught her that a pen could be mightier than a Kalashnikov but infinitely more dangerous to wield. You're asking me to choose between exposing the crimes and protecting the country's stability, she said finally. President Traoré's laugh was short and sharp. No, my dear. I'm asking you something far more difficult. He leaned forward, his eyes boring into hers with an intensity that made her skin prickle. I'm asking you to help me determine whether destroying our enemies is worth destroying ourselves. He stood and walked to the bronze sculpture of Thomas Sankara, running his fingers along the revolutionary's determined jawline. Your namesake understood this dilemma better than most. He knew that true independence meant more than simply replacing white faces with black ones in the halls of power. It meant fundamentally restructuring our relationship with the world. But Sankara was assassinated for his ideals, Aminata pointed out, her voice barely above a whisper. Exactly. The president's reflection in the bronze seemed to merge with Sankara's features, past and present becoming one. He chose truth over pragmatism, justice over survival. The question is, was he right to do so? The weight of the question pressed against Aminata's chest like a physical force. She thought of her grandmother's stories about the early days of independence, when hope had burned bright as a harmattan fire and the future seemed limitless as the Sahel sky. Then came the coups, the counter-coups, the structural adjustment programs that had turned sovereignty into a cruel joke. "May I ask you something, Mr. President?" He nodded, his attention fully focused on her. "The uranium mines, how much do you know about the extent of the contamination?" His pause was so slight she almost missed it, but Aminata had spent years learning to read the spaces between words, the silence that spoke louder than speeches. "I know enough to understand that some truths carry a price we may not be willing to pay. And if the price is paid by people like Burima Ouedraogo, the taxi driver's brother who died believing his sacrifice meant something." The president's face hardened, the diplomatic mask slipping just enough to reveal the steel beneath. "Don't presume to lecture me about sacrifice, young woman. I've buried more good men than you've interviewed. The difference between us is that I must weigh each death against the survival of millions." He moved to his desk, withdrawing a thick folder bound with red ribbon. "Do you know what this contains?" Aminata shook her head. "Casualty projections. Economic impact assessments. Social stability reports." He untied the ribbon with deliberate slowness. All of them were commissioned to answer a single question. What happens to Burkina Faso if we completely sever our ties with France and their mining interests? The folder's contents spilled across the desk like entrails from a sacrificial offering, charts, graphs, photographs, and reports that painted a picture of a nation teetering on the edge of an abyss. Aminata leaned forward, her journalist's eye automatically cataloging the data even as her heart recoiled from its implications. 23% unemployment within 6 months, the president read from one report. 58% drop in foreign investment. Complete collapse of the healthcare system within 2 years. He lifted a photograph showing a refugee camp, children with distended bellies staring at the camera with eyes that had seen too much. This was taken in Mali after they attempted to nationalize their mining operations. The French response was comprehensive. Aminata's hands trembled as she reached for another document. It was a medical report detailing cancer rates in the mining regions, the same data she had used in her exposé but with additional projections she had never seen. "These numbers are worse than what you published, yes. We've known about the contamination for years. The question has never been whether to act, but how to act without triggering a humanitarian catastrophe." The president sat heavily in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 57 years. "You want to know why I summoned you here? It wasn't to silence you or to offer you money or threats. It was to ask for your help in finding a third option." A third option? Between truth and survival. Between justice and pragmatism. Between being right and being wise. He gestured to the scattered documents. "Your articles have given us leverage we didn't have before. International attention, moral authority, global sympathy. The question is, how do we use that leverage to actually help our people instead of simply satisfying our consciences?" The call to evening prayer drifted through the office windows as Aminata struggled to process the magnitude of what she was being shown. Her carefully constructed narrative of heroes and villains was dissolving into something far more complex and morally ambiguous. "There's something else," the president said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. He withdrew a single sheet of paper from his jacket pocket, unfolding it with the care reserved for handling explosives. "This arrived yesterday through diplomatic channels." Aminata read the document twice before its contents fully registered. It was a formal proposal from the French government, offering to establish a massive healthcare fund for mining region residents in exchange for revised reporting on contamination levels and a guarantee of continued mining rights. 50 million euros, she breathed. That's enough to build hospitals, train doctors, provide treatment for everyone affected. Blood money, the president said flatly. But blood money that could save lives. The question is it worth the price of our integrity? Aminata set the paper down as if it were on fire. And if we refuse? Then we maintain our moral purity while watching our people die from treatable diseases because we lack the resources to help them. The president's voice carried the weight of a man who had stared into the abyss of impossible choices. "Tell me, Mademoiselle Sankara, what would your namesake do?" The ancestors' voices seemed to whisper through the evening air, carried on the wind that rustled the baobab leaves outside the window. Aminata closed her eyes and let herself drift back to her grandmother's stories, tales of resistance and compromise, of heroes who sometimes had to choose between their principles and their people. "My grandmother used to tell me about the resistance during colonial times," she said slowly. There were those who fought openly, taking to the bush with whatever weapons they could find. And there were those who worked within the system, wearing the colonizers' uniforms while secretly supporting the resistance. And which does she say were the true patriots? Aminata opened her eyes, meeting the president's gaze. She said that history would judge them all by one measure, whether their choices served the people or served their own sense of righteousness. The president nodded slowly. Wisdom often comes wrapped in the cloth of bitter experience. They sat in contemplative silence as the shadows lengthened and the city beyond the palace walls settled into its evening rhythms. Aminata could hear the distant sound of drummers practicing for some celebration, their rhythms echoing the heartbeat of a continent that had survived conquest, colonization, and countless betrayals. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked finally. President Traoré stood and walked to a wall map of Burkina Faso, his finger tracing the borders that had been drawn by European powers with no regard for ethnic or cultural boundaries. "I'm proposing that we redefine what victory looks like. Instead of simply exposing the crimes and watching our enemies retreat to fight another day, we use your journalism as a weapon of negotiation." He turned back to her, his expression intense. "Your articles have already accomplished something remarkable. They've made it impossible for the French to simply ignore the situation. But now we need to channel that pressure into concrete gains for our people. You want me to become a tool of diplomacy rather than journalism? I want you to become something more powerful than either." He moved back to his desk, pulling out a detailed map of the mining regions. "Look at this. Every red dot represents a contaminated site. Every blue dot represents a village where children are dying from preventable cancers. Every green dot represents a location where the French are extracting uranium worth millions of dollars." Aminata studied the map, noting how the dots clustered around the major mining operations like blood cells surrounding a wound. "The pattern is clear. The contamination follows the extraction sites." "Exactly. And now imagine if we could use your platform to propose a comprehensive solution, not just demanding that the French leave, but forcing them to pay for the cleanup while transitioning to local ownership of the resources." The president's finger traced a route between the mining sites. Phase 1. International pressure through continued journalism and advocacy. Phase 2. Negotiated compensation for past damages. Phase 3. Technology transfer and local capacity building. Phase 4. Gradual transition to full Burkinabe control. Aminata felt a stirring of something she hadn't experienced since childhood. The sensation of possibilities expanding rather than contracting, of solutions emerging from the chaos of seemingly impossible problems. And if the French refuse to negotiate? Then we have the moral authority to pursue more drastic measures with international support. The president's smile was sharp as a blade. "But if they agree to negotiate, we gain something far more valuable than revenge. We gain the power to actually heal our land and our people." She thought of Burima Ouedraogo, dying in poverty while French shareholders profited from his sacrifice. She thought of Mariam Zongo, coughing blood into a basin while holding her husband's photograph. She thought of the children playing in radioactive dust, their laughter echoing across contaminated playgrounds. "There would be risks," she said slowly. "If this plan became public before we were ready, the French could withdraw entirely. The economic disruption could be devastating." "Every act of resistance carries risk," the president replied. "The question is whether we're willing to risk our comfort for our children's future." Aminata reached for her notebook, her journalist's instincts awakening to the story that was unfolding before her. Not just the story of corporate exploitation and government corruption, but the story of a new kind of resistance, one that used the colonizers' own systems against them. "I would need guarantees," she said. "Complete access to all government files related to the mining operations. The right to publish interim reports on our progress. And most importantly, a commitment that this isn't just another way of kicking the problem down the road." The president extended his hand across the desk. "You have my word, Mademoiselle Sankara. But more than that, you have my partnership. This isn't about using you as a tool, it's about recognizing that some fights require both the warrior and the diplomat." As their hands met, Aminata felt the weight of history settling on her shoulders like a traditional Kent cloth, heavy with significance but also warm with possibility. Through the window, she could see the first stars appearing in the darkening sky, the same stars that had guided her ancestors through centuries of struggle and survival. "There's one more thing," she said. "I want to visit the mining sites again. Not as a journalist gathering information, but as a partner in developing solutions. The people there need to know that their stories matter, that their suffering isn't being forgotten or relegated to footnotes in diplomatic cables. The president nodded. Agreed. And I want to go with you. It's time the president of Burkina Faso saw firsthand what we're asking our people to sacrifice for uranium they'll never benefit from. The room fell quiet again, but this time the silence felt different, charged with purpose rather than weighted with despair. Aminata thought of the baobab tree where she had prayed that morning, its ancient roots reaching deep into African soil while its branches stretched toward limitless sky. When do we begin? She asked. We began the moment you walked into this office, the president replied. The question now is how far we're willing to go to see it through. As night settled over Ouagadougou like a blanket woven from starlight and possibility, Aminata gathered her notes and prepared to leave the palace that had seemed so imposing when she arrived. But something had shifted during the hours of conversation. The building no longer felt like a symbol of power held over the people, but rather a place where power might be wielded for them. The president walked her to the door, his earlier formality replaced by the easy camaraderie of conspirators sharing a noble cause. There will be challenges, he said. Moments when the easy path seems more appealing than the right one. When the French offer sweeter deals in exchange for our silence. When our own people question whether change is worth the risk. And how do we handle those moments? We remember why we started this journey. He paused at the threshold, looking out over the city where millions of lives hung in the balance of decisions made in rooms like this one. We remember that true independence isn't just about flag and national anthem. It's about having the power to choose our own future, even when that future is uncertain. Aminata stepped into the warm night air, breathing in the scents of wood smoke and frying plantains, listening to the distant laughter of children whose futures might depend on the choices made in the coming months. The weight of her grandmother's cowrie shells pressed against her chest, a reminder of the ancestors who had faced their own impossible choices and somehow found the wisdom to survive. As she walked toward the palace gates, she heard the president call out behind her, "Barkase." The more blessing for a safe journey. She turned and raised her hand in acknowledgement, then stepped into the night that suddenly seemed full of promise rather than danger. The taxi ride back through the city streets felt different than the morning's journey, as if she were seeing Ouagadougou through new eyes. The corrugated iron roofs that had seemed like dragon scales now looked like shields protecting the dreams of their inhabitants. The vendors calling out their wares sounded like griots singing the continuing story of a people who refused to be defeated by history. When they passed the spot where Mama Fatou sold her groundnuts, Aminata asked the driver to stop. The woman was closing up her stall, carefully packing away the day's remaining nuts in worn cloth bags. "Mama Fatou," Aminata called out as she approached. "I wanted to thank you for your words this morning." The older woman looked up, her eyes reflecting the streetlight like pools of ancient wisdom. "And did you find what you were looking for at the palace?" "I found something I wasn't looking for," Aminata replied. "I found a way forward that doesn't require choosing between truth and hope." Mama Fatou smiled, her weathered hands continuing their practiced work. "The ancestors are pleased, child. I can see it in the way you carry yourself now, not bent under the weight of impossible choices, but straight with the knowledge that some paths only reveal themselves when we're brave enough to walk into the darkness." As the taxi pulled away, Aminata caught a glimpse of the woman in the side mirror, standing among her empty stalls like a guardian spirit watching over the dreams of a continent. The sight filled her with a sense of connection to something larger than herself, a chain of resistance and resilience that stretched back through generations and forward into possibilities yet to be born. Later that night, sitting in her small apartment overlooking the sprawling neighborhoods of Ouagadougou, Aminata opened her notebook and began to write. But for the first time in months, she wasn't documenting tragedy or exposing corruption. Instead, she found herself crafting something new, a story of transformation, of power wielded not for conquest but for healing. The words flowed like water finding its course, each sentence building toward a vision of what Burkina Faso could become if its people refused to accept the false choice between dignity and development. She wrote about the uranium mines, but not as symbols of exploitation, as resources that could fund hospitals and schools if properly managed. She wrote about the French, not as irredeemable villains but as partners who could be forced to choose between short-term profits and long-term legitimacy. Most importantly, she wrote about her own journey from anger to action, from the comfortable certainty of moral outrage to the complex challenge of constructive change. The story that emerged wasn't the simple narrative of good versus evil she had expected to tell, but something richer and more truthful. A story about the messy, difficult work of building a better world from the materials at hand. As dawn broke over the red earth of Burkina Faso, Aminata set down her pen and looked out at the city, awakening to another day of struggle and possibility. The baobab trees stood silhouetted against the lightning sky like ancient sentinels, marking the passage from night to day, from past to future, from the weight of history to the promise of what could be. In 6 hours she would board a plane to visit the mining regions, not as an investigative journalist hunting for evidence of crimes, but as a partner in crafting solutions. President Traoré would be with her, ready to face the consequences of decades of policy decisions made in distant capitals without regard for the people they affected. The flight would carry them over landscapes scarred by extraction and exploitation, but also over villages where children played and women sang while they worked, where the rhythms of life continued despite everything that had been taken from them. And in those rhythms, Aminata knew, lay the drumbeat of a resistance that would outlast any colonial power, any mining company, any force that sought to reduce the richness of African life to a simple resource to be exploited. The ancestors had whispered their wisdom through the voice of an old groundnut seller, through the scarred hands of a taxi driver, through the calculating eyes of a president who had chosen the harder path over the easier one. Now it was time for the children to hear that wisdom and carry it forward into whatever future they would build from the ashes of the past and the possibilities of the present. Outside her window, the city stirred to life with the familiar sounds of another day in Africa, the call to prayer mixing with the cry of hawkers, the rumble of overcrowded buses blending with the laughter of children walking to school. It was the sound of survival, of resilience, of a people who had learned that sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating your enemies but from transforming them into partners and building something better than either could achieve alone. Alhamdulillah, Aminata whispered to the rising sun, feeling the weight of her grandmother's cowrie shells and the lightness of possibility merging into something she had never experienced before, the sensation of being exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she needed to do, in service of a story that was still being written by millions of hands across a continent that had never stopped believing in its own future. The flight to meet the president of Burkina Faso had already begun, she realized. It had begun the moment she chose to see beyond the simple narrative of victimization and villain to the more complex truth of human beings struggling to build dignity from the materials history had left them. And it would continue long after any individual plane had landed, in the daily choices made by people who refused to accept that their children's future had to be mortgaged to pay for the sins of the past. In the distance, she could hear the drums of the morning prayers beginning to fade, replaced by the steady rhythm of a continent waking up to face another day of the only struggle that had ever mattered, the struggle to remain human in the face of forces that sought to reduce humanity to mere commodity. It was a beautiful sound, she thought, as she prepared for the journey ahead. The sound of a people flying toward their own future, carrying with them the wisdom of the ancestors and the hope of the children yet to be born.